Hey there! Today's podcast is all about programming the systems that operate the rides and shows at Walt Disney World. My guest is David Snyder, who developed a new system that made Walt Disney World possible. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society Podcast. Thanks so much for joining me here on episode 74 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. One thing about doing this podcast is I keep discovering that there are so many sections of Disney history that I know pretty much nothing about. I've read a lot of books about it. I've talked to a lot of people, but still, the story is so much more complicated, and there are figures that have had huge contributions where most of us don't know their stories. And a perfect example is David Snyder, my guest today on the podcast. He was hired by Disney in 1968 to develop new programming and show controls for Walt Disney World. And as you know, Disney World was going to open 3 years later, and they wanted to put in a show system. And the show system is not the same as what's in Disneyland. So he worked to develop the Digital Animation Control System, otherwise known as DACS or DACS. And that system basically operated any types of rides and shows at Walt Disney World. Beyond that, he also worked on a system for audio animatronics, for making more believable mouth movements and lip syncing, which is known as the Symbolic Mouth Action Control System, or SMACS. That's really just the most basic thing. He also worked on shows at Communicore and for EPCOT Center. He also developed a new computer system, ACES, for the black hole, which led to much better special effects shots in movies. Snyder's impact on Walt Disney World deserves more attention. He does have a window on Main Street, which reads, "The Human Dynamo Calculating Machine Company, Michael Bagnall, Office Manager, David Snyder, Program Supervisor." But like myself, I didn't know much about his story, and I suspect that's the case for a lot of you, even big-time Walt Disney World fans. Before we get to my conversation with David, I did want to quickly mention that the Tomorrow Society podcast is a listener-supported show. There's no sponsors, no weird ad breaks. How this show keeps going is through generous contributions by listeners like you, through members of the Tomorrow Society through Patreon. A small pledge can help to keep this show going, and also you can get some cool perks like a membership card and a pin, plus access to the monthly Tomorrow Society Bulletin podcast, which is exclusively for members. You can learn more at patreon.com/Tomorrow Society. That's patreon.com/Tomorrow Society. So I really enjoy the chance to get to talk with David and learn more about his story. He's extremely candid about challenges that he faced when you're bringing new technologies into an established system. There's going to be a lot of politics. There's going to be pushback from people that say, we've always done it a certain way and it's worked. Why are you trying to introduce new things, especially involving computers? So it was a challenge for him. And I appreciate that he was honest and talking about some of the difficulties there. But the results at Disney World stand for themselves, and I really appreciate the chance to get to hear more about David's story. So let's get to the conversation. Here is David Snyder. Back when you were younger, what got you interested in early computers or programming at the start?
Well, you have to realize that I was born in the late 30s, where we grew up with radios, and there was no TV, there was no internet, there was no cell phone, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the things that I became interested in was chemistry, because my father was a graduate chemist. And when I was, I don't know what age, but maybe 10 or so, he used to bring home a chemistry set with a few extra chemicals now and then. And I would experiment with those and mostly make rocket ships that typically started fires on people's property. And all of the chemicals that would create an explosion or something were quickly depleted out of my chemistry system. So I had to go on to something else. And I ended up, when I was in the Cub Scouts, we ended up with the projects of things like a crystal radio and little tiny motors and things like that. And then I had a friend, his name was Glenn, and I haven't told anybody about this, but he was into electricity, not electronics. He was into electricity. And he had a thing called a Ford coil. And I don't know if you know what that is, but basically it's a thing that generates giant sparks. If you hook it to a 12-volt battery on the front end and interrupt that 12 volts, it will create a huge spark across a gap of about almost an inch, enough to shock the hell out of you. I mean, you're not going to get electrocuted, but it really shocks. We used to go around the neighborhood, and I don't know why I did this, but this is what we did. We put the Ford coil on a car battery on a radio flyer wagon. We used to go around the neighborhood. We had the Ford coil hooked up so that at the top of a post, which actually was a recycled TV antenna, we would zap and make a spark at the top. And of course, you can imagine that interrupted people's television, because they were watching TV at the time, very early television, and maybe radio, but early television was being disrupted, especially if we were right outside the front porch. And we would go to people and say, "Oh, I understand you're having some disruption on your television, and we can fix that for $1 or whatever." And of course, we knew how to fix it, which was turn off the friggin' Ford coil. That was such great fun, and we earned between that and collecting bottles and cans, bottles at that time, we were making money being disruptors. So as I got to be a little bit older, the thing to do for let's say a 12-year-old was to go to the movies, and the movies were very interesting. Western movies were great. There was a lot of shooting and stuff, and we had a theater in Hollywood. I'm a Hollywood native, by the way. I was born in Hollywood, and one of the few left, I suppose. So we had a theater called the Hitching Post. We'd go there, and of course, as kids, we had guns strapped to our sides. Those are cap guns, obviously. And we'd go to the theater and watch the movies, and I'd always be looking behind me, seeing, what's going on in the box back there where there's whatever it was, 3 or 4 little holes with the light coming out. And one day I went up and knocked on the door and managed to ask the guy if I could look in. And he let me look in and showed me all this strange-looking equipment and told me a little bit about what he did, but he really didn't want to hang out with a kid. And I just thought, well, that's pretty slick. Maybe that's something I could do when I get older. Jumping ahead pretty far, when I left grammar school, went to junior high school, I got involved in things like physics experiments and chemistry experiments. It was kind of fun. That was in junior high school, went on through high school. And in high school, I got further interested in electrical stuff, magnetism, electronics, whatever. And sometime in my youth, when I was definitely when I was in probably the first year of junior high school or the last year or two of grammar school, a friend and I, for whatever reason, I don't know why for sure, but we climbed over the fence at the Walt Disney Company on their back lot, which was sort of unmanned, and it was kind of interesting because they were always shooting stuff there during the day, but they didn't do stuff at night. And we just wanted to see what it was like. So we crawled over the fence, to look around and promptly got, I'll call it, quote, arrested, end quote, by the gendarmes, whose job it was to keep kids out of the place. And I thought, well, that was kind of crappy. We were hoping to have a good time. And then a couple of weeks later, we decided, because we were so unlucky at Disney, we'd go try the same thing at Universal, which was about 2 miles away. I'm not sure how we got there. Probably took the bus and went over the fence. Probably a minute later than the Disney guys, we got nailed by Universal, and our parents had to come and take us out. In any case, I thought, there's interesting stuff there. I don't know what it is, but it's interesting. And I remember seeing the projection equipment in the theater. And so time went on, and as eventually I went into junior college, and I didn't know what I wanted to do in adult life. So I took some general ed classes, and I took a couple of science-type classes, most specifically physics and mathematics in junior college. My parents were I don't want to say they were poor, but they were hardworking, lower-income people. My father worked at Lockheed. My mother did some things with baby photography, with a photo lab in our house, in the bathroom and the back porch. And in any case, I didn't want to do that. Photography was interesting, but in junior college, the only way to make money for me was to look for jobs. And one of the jobs I found was a job working for Librascope General Precision, who at that time was a Navy subcontractor building all kinds of naval-oriented equipment, including at that time a special purpose computer. So I went to school at night and worked at Librascope General Precision during the days, and then I went to school at days and worked at nights. General Precision was a 24-hour operation. So I was typically working a good 40-hour shift and making what I thought at the time was fantastic big money. And my job there initially was to make, I'm going to call it wire wrapping cable harnesses. You can imagine, even today, almost every piece of electronics has got a big loom of cables going from point A to point B. Maybe it might be 10, 20, sometimes 50 or 100 cables. And at that time, those cables were made by wrapping multiple cables around a bunch of pegs and a piece of plywood, because they had to be bent to shape to accommodate the devices that were plugged in the one side and plugged in the other side. And I did that for X number of months, and it was terrible. I thought, this is a crap job. But the boss on the line liked me. He liked the fact that I was on time, and I did what I was supposed to do, and I didn't talk back. I didn't take long bathroom breaks, and I got promoted. I got promoted to work on the assembly line, soldering transistors and diodes into circuit boards. And I thought, oh, this is kind of cool, because it was really paying the big bucks. And I knew what a transistor was, and I knew what a diode was, and I was suddenly learning other things about a thing like a capacitor and a resistor. I was on a learning curve between school and working there. I was learning stuff. I was good at that. And after a short while, I got promoted to a final assembly test participation, where all the circuit boards that I had been soldering and et cetera were being tested for appropriate function. We had some test equipment that was kind of crude, but nonetheless it did, I guess, what it's supposed to do. And that was kind of fun, because I found a lot of problems, and there were certain ways that we were able to isolate what the problems were. And we're talking about discrete components, of course. And I did good on that, and I got promoted, to what was called test and adjust. And the test and adjust was the area where the very, very final testing of all the things that had been made by all the previous workers, both mechanical, electromechanical, and pure electronic, all came together in a big chassis made design for the Navy. And it was my job, along with one or two other people, to turn on the power and put it through its paces. We had, a test procedure that had been written by engineers and Navy personnel. And when we didn't get the appropriate answers in our test procedure, we had to troubleshoot to find out where the errors were. So we had to understand the electromechanical parts, servo mechanisms, etc. And we had to understand the computer, which, as it turns out, was a dual processing machine. Computer A and computer B running exactly the same program, voting with each other to decide if they were okay. And if one hiccuped, there was a red flag and things would stop. And that machinery was destined to be what was called fire control equipment, meaning missile aiming and shooting on destroyers and submarines. So knowing the product as I did, and, I have to keep telling you that sometimes I don't sound very, I'm not sure what the word is, but sound like I blew my own horn, but I was good at this for some reason. I don't know why. Anyway, I was asked if I would like to join the field service organization as a field engineer. And of course, at that time, I was not an engineer, but that was the title. Maybe the first title was field technician, but in any case, I eventually had a title field engineer. And my job then was to go out with the final products that I'd been testing in the test and adjust area and install them on the Navy ships, the destroyers and the submarines both. And I traveled all over the United States, coastal cities, doing that kind of work, doing that installation. And in addition to the installation, going on sea trials with the full complement of missiles, etc., and also a full complement of civilians, one of which I was. I was the youngest one by far to be doing that. And I had a friend, co-worker, and he had specialized more in the electromechanical stuff, and I had specialized almost out of necessity on the computer side. And I got to be a real whiz with computers, and this is probably before you were born, but certainly before any computer that you ever heard of was in existence, minus the hardwire things that were being used in university laboratories and stuff. These computers, out of necessity, had to be what was called real-time computers. In other words, they were not data processing devices. You didn't stick in punch cards and wait 5 minutes for an answer. You had to work at high speed, microsecond speed, to aim missiles and shoot missiles and be accurate, etc. So there you go, all the way through to labor scope. And then I got shanghaied to interview at Disney, and that becomes yet another chapter in the story.
Yeah. Well, yeah, the things you mentioned about computers, it's definitely, I'm 43 years old, so it's definitely before computer I'm used to, but it's fascinating to me how that sort of built up. And also, too, like you mentioned, you were really doing well there and had moved up to a pretty high level just through being really good at what you did. So that raised a good question, because you ended up moving to Disney. How did that happen? How did you end up going from sounded like a really rising career working on things like missiles and such in that industry, and then shifting over to do computers and programming for Disney?
Well, I told you about becoming a field engineer and doing that for a couple of years. It became a little less fun. It started to be, I don't swim, by the way, and so I was out to sea a lot, which always made me nervous. And I eventually left the field service department because the mathematics department, which was called the math department, they were actually mathematicians and one or two people that knew how to program a computer. I was asked to join that department and help program the very same computer that I actually had put together and learned how to troubleshoot. I did not know how to program the computer when I was testing them. I knew how to troubleshoot them, but I could not program them. So I was brought into the mathematics department, which could well have been called computer programming. And I was a rookie there. I had a great boss who took me under his wing and started showing me tricks of the trade of how to do programming. And you have to realize that the things you may know as a higher level language did not exist at that time. Higher level languages did not exist with one or two exceptions, specifically COBOL, which was being used for data processing and payroll, etc., and Fortran, which was being used for mathematical calculations for whatever. So I learned to be a programmer. As a programmer, and I'll just say I was like the number one or number two programmer. I used to get called on, and I was in a couple of organizations. I was active in a thing that was called ACM, Association for Computer Machinery. I was kind of active in that. I was an IEEE member at some point in time. I forget when that was, and there were one or two other smaller groups of nerdy, techie people. And one day a guy came to me and said, "Hey, Snyder, we understand you're doing these programs over there and shooting missiles and stuff like that and doing mathematics and real-time stuff. Why don't you come over to Disney? We're gonna do some really cool stuff." And it was interesting because my office, which was at 800 Flower Street, 800 Western Avenue in Glendale, my office window looked out across the street at the very first WED Enterprises Disney building, little tiny building.
Wow.
And I used to sit at my desk and sometimes go to the window and look over there, and it said Walt Disney Productions, WED Enterprises, nothing else. And I would say, what do you suppose those guys are doing over there? I don't know what they're doing. As it turns out, what they were doing, which I later found out, was they were working on the World's Fair and, thinking about how to make their products better, how to make shows better, audio and electronics better, whatever. But it was World's Fair time, and that's what they were doing. And I was looking out the window, and when the guy came and said, "Hey, come see us," I thought, well, Jesus, I can use the same parking lot. It's only a couple miles away. I hate driving. What's to lose? Oh, I have to back up one step. Right near my career end at Librascope, most of the time at Librascope, I did not have a degree. I had a 2-year degree in electronics technology or whatever it was called. And I finally got my final degree in electronic engineering about a year before I left Librascope. And my boss, his name was Harry Ford. I said, "Harry, I've got this opportunity to interview across the street. They're going to do some cool stuff. I don't know what it is, but Disney. And, suddenly the Disney name was magical even back then, especially for basically a kid. I was still very young. And I went across the street and interviewed at a different building, not the one I had looked out the window. I can tell you about the interview or not, because the interview itself is sort of a story.
Oh, yeah. I'd love to hear about the interview.
I went over to what then was called WED, Walter E. Disney, WD, WED Enterprises, as you know, now called Walt Disney Imagineering. And it was at the 1401 Flower Street building. And I went into a conference room. There was a survey guy who was a hot shot. There was a mechanical engineer. There was one or two employee relations, hire, fire people. There was an architectural genius there. What there wasn't there was anybody that knew what a computer was if it jumped up and hit them in the face. And these guys were asking me basically, I'm going to use the word stupid. I mean, they were naive. They were asking me naive questions, questions that did not hit the mark for what I thought they wanted to do. It was hard for me to ascertain exactly what this group of bozos wanted because they were unable to articulate it. And I thought to myself, no, Harry Ford knows I do a good job. I'm not going to work for these guys. I can do a bang-up job or a crappy job. They won't have a clue. And if I do a crappy job, they're going to fire me after a year anyway. They offered me a year's position with a potential of follow-on work if I was a good guy. I actually stood up at the interview and said, listen, gentlemen, I need to decline your offer. You know, your salary is attractive. I mean, you're right across the street. I can park where I used to and walk over here. And the stuff I see on your wall is pretty cool looking, but none of you has a clue what you want to do. You can't articulate it, and I don't want to have any one of you guys be my boss, because nobody here in this room will know if I'm doing a good job, average job, or a crap job. And I need to work with somebody that knows something about what I'm doing. So I left and basically walked back across the street to Librascope. My boss, Harry Ford, said, well, how did that go? I said, not well. I said, I'm not going to be there. The guy that had enticed me in the first place called me the next day and said, David, what is your problem? I said, I don't have a problem. What are you talking about? He said, you're turning down the chance of a lifetime, blah, 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 work for the mouse, do this, do that. I said, yeah, that sounded great, but I can't work for any of those guys. They seem like nice people. Maybe they know how to do survey work, or they knew how to do mechanical engineering, and maybe they knew how to do, I don't know what, but they weren't doing anything that I knew how to do. And he said, well, I want you to come back and have another interview. And I said, well, there's a point at which I'm going to have to charge you for this because I'm taking time off and Harry's not happy with me. I went back, had another interview, but this time they had the chief information officer. Actually, maybe he was the vice president of the corporation. His name was Michael Bagnall. And he was in charge of all the data processing and computer stuff at the studio, which meant payroll, inventory, blah, blah, boring stuff, okay, non-real-time stuff. And they had a room full of people punching punch cards and timekeepers writing out sheets, and Michael Bagnall's people did that. But at least he knew what a computer was. There was another gentleman with him whose name I believe was Tom Foster, who was the hands-on computer, running the computer guy at the time. And Tom Foster actually asked me a couple of interesting questions, like, what do I know about bits and bytes, so to speak? I said, I know about that stuff. And I liked them. They offered me more money than the guys did the day before. And they said, come work here for a year. You're going to love it so much, you're going to stay forever. So I resigned from Librascope once and for all and started working for Disney in 1968 as a one-man department under the auspices of the data processing group, which was called Management Information Systems, actually, at the time. Michael Bagnall, Tom Foster, and then a guy by the name of Jack Cornwell. And I had an office at the studio, and I had an office at the WIT Enterprises. So that's how I got there. There's a chapter for you.
1968, too, is so interesting, as you know, because Disney World, was going to open in 3 years. And like you said, you were a department of one person. Disney World had a lot of systems that needed to go in place. So I'd love to know, I know eventually it led to the digital animation control system, but when you came in, like, how did you get started in what eventually became that system and actually creating something that would work for such a massive place?
Well, in some respects, it was easy, and I'll tell you why. Disneyland was up and operating and making lots of money. The World's Fair had been incredibly successful. Walt Disney was proud of the World's Fair, and, he caused Disneyland to open and be successful. And Disneyland was being run on a show-by-show basis. Show A would be run with technology A, show B with technology B, show C with technology C and D from the School of Popular Mechanics, as I typically called it. And almost each show was being run by a different, I'm going to call it a system, but a different Rube Goldberg, to tell you the truth. And these things broke down a lot. And when they broke down, because each one had been often designed by an individual. Maybe Waco Rogers designed this one. And so if it broke down, the other guys didn't know how to fix it. And more than likely, there weren't any spare parts for it.
Oh, geez.
Nobody paid attention to things like spare parts and commonality of fixing stuff and how to start it and how to stop it. It was spread around through a bunch of popular mechanics guys. There wasn't one engineer in the park in terms of electronics. They had guys that knew how to plug in electricity and turn on lights. I don't mean to demean those people because they are super important. But in terms of electronics, there was none. So I walk into Disney and they say, "Oh, David, and by the way, we're opening this park in Florida in October of 1971, and we want you to think about all these different systems that we have at Disneyland, and maybe one of those systems is the one we should use for all the shows and rides, by the way, at opening of Walt Disney World." So I thought, man, that doesn't sound very good to me, but I went down to Disneyland in the friggin' traffic. It was, it's like 40 miles away from the office. And I would visit each of the, I'll call them backstage areas, and I'd see popular mechanics here and popular science there. And I would talk to some of the old guys, and most of them were old, by the way. They were really old guys. And I'd say, "Oh, how does this work?" "Oh, well, you got a lever and a push button and a rubber band, and, it all works." We're not sure exactly, but it was in popular mechanics a couple of years ago. And, I'm exaggerating, but basically that's what it was. And after about 3 trips down there, I came home and I thought, this ain't going to work. There is no frigging way that they will open a 27,000-acre park in 71 running all these popular mechanics rides, Rube Goldberg rides. So the guy that hired me and we started writing down and brainstorming an idea that why don't we have something that's centrally located, and out at each show area we'll have common equipment. And so when common equipment dies, the central stairs will have the stairs, and there you go. Your downtime, which at that time was called 101 time, your downtime would be minimized and, things would be under control. Well, that sounded great. Oh, okay, how are you going to do that? Walt Disney Imagineering had exactly 0 computer or electronic people. I was it. They had a great department of electrical engineers doing power distribution, 1,000 volts here and there, and all the way down to 220 and down to 110 so that you could turn on lights and cook food and whatever. But not one electronic engineer, certainly not one computer person.
How do you build a team that way? I mean, where do you start?
We decided that the answer to the problem would be a central situation where 1 or 2 computers would be running everything. Obviously, when you started thinking about it, the scary part was if one went down, the whole park is down. That wasn't a cool idea. So we decided that it had to be distributed so that there would be central computers. Those central computers would only be sitting around monitoring the health of all the distributed processors. So we wrote a specification about basically what, if you understand what a functional specification is, it's different than a technical spec. Functional spec just says, here's what we want to do. We're not going to tell you how, but here's what we want to do. And by the way, here's when we want to do it. Oh my God, you're kidding. So we did that, and this functional specification went out to some of the biggest names in computers, including RCA, because Sarnoff had a handshake with Walt Disney, and people like Minneapolis Honeywell, and I'm forgetting the names of all the computer companies back then, but basically probably 10 computer companies. They got the functional specification. We said, what we want is your response in this period of time with a technical spec. You know what we want. Now tell us how you can make it happen. So several companies responded and said, no chance, we can't do it. What you're asking for is right next to impossible, especially with the time frame. Adios, Charlie. But a couple of them came back and said, here's how we think we could do it. And their thinking was kind of along the thoughts of our thinking. And so we went back to them again and said, okay, we like your ideas. How much are you going to charge us? It's a 3-step process. Functionality first, technical implementation second, and obviously cost. And within cost, we have budget and schedule. My recollection is 3 companies responded. Data General is one of them that responded. Univac responded, and they were going to do this stuff with a giant mainframe. We just said, no, that's not going to happen. And we had a lot of pressure to use Sperry Univac because there were some business relationships going on between Disney and Sperry at the time. There was a company in Orange County, 45 minutes away, right, a stone's throw from Disneyland, called Astrodata. Astrodata had a great technical specification or technical response to our request for a quote and a pretty decent cost. Said, yeah, we can do this by 1971. I said, well, wait, we didn't tell you the whole story. We opened in 1971. We have to have all these shows going by 1971, not that your machine's going to work. Your machine's got to work way before that because it's got to run all this stuff and help us program all these shows. They said, oh, well, I think we can do that. And they started, and we gave them money. We gave them a chunk of money. And in about 1971 or 70, Astrodata started falling on hard times. They had built some equipment custom tailored for our use, including an animator's console, as we were going to drive 4 consoles at one time, and some other stuff. They were a very well-known aerospace company. They did all kinds of cool stuff for the military. They did go into bankruptcy because of my history at Libroscope. I had made sure that our company had put customer-furnished equipment tags on everything because we had paid for it. The sheriff came in and locked their doors. We had CFE tags. We went down with a moving van. Sheriff opened the door. We walked in, said, see those tags, all that stuff there? That's ours. Okay, take it. So we took all that stuff and we took it back up to Glendale and installed it, such as it was, installed it in a building that was called the Maple Building. Basically, we had, I'm going to call it a bag of parts. It was better than that, but it was a bag of parts. Nothing worked. Just absolutely nothing worked. That's all I can tell you. So you could plug it in. There were some lights that went on. But there was no way that you could program a show. And here I am, not familiar with the computer that was finally chosen, which it turns out was a 16-bit Honeywell computer. And I'm by myself, and I'm thinking, well, I think I should have stuck with the Libroscope. So I hired a guy that had been my closest working partner at Libroscope, at which point Harry Ford swore at me yet a second time for stealing his second best guy. And then I stole his third best guy and his fourth best guy. And we set up this little department, and I recognized that we still didn't have enough manpower. So I went on a hiring spree and started hiring programmers, real-time programmers, guys out of aerospace, guys that really knew the nuts and bolts about computers and could write code, such as it was at the time. By hook or by crook, with long days and weekends and et cetera, we got the system up and running so that animators could animate a show in real time and play a show back with one of the distributed devices and have it played back time after time, accurately each time. And we had commonality of parts and a commonality of people that knew how to fix stuff. And there we were, with one exception. And that is, you can imagine, when you first bring up a system that's never been wrung out, we had animators sitting at the console, and they would do work for 5, 6, 7 hours, and all of a sudden, zap. Oh, my God, what happened? It's like, we have to reboot. Let's reboot. Well, when you reboot, so to speak, all their data's gone. I mean, that was, this is exaggerating the nuisance of it all. But nonetheless, data would be gone. The animators would sit around and fidget and swear and whatever. And by the way, it was a job in itself to get the animators, the old-time animators that had been brought over from the studio to, I'll just say, relax and buy into the fact that there was going to be a computer that was going to let them animate shows instead of the the popular mechanics ways that they've been used for World's Fair and Disneyland. That was its own sales pitch. And yours truly was the guy that got to do that sales pitch while I was still trying to write code. So I had split my days up for a while on explaining the virtues of computers and writing code at the same time. And of course, the end of the story is all as well. We installed it in Florida. Almost all the glitches were gone. Park opened in October on time. Not on budget, by the way, but on time. Me and my crew, so to speak, were there on opening day, bursting into tears out of being tired and just thinking, wow, we made it. And basically, what we did then, in some cases, is still exactly the same thing as running, and in most other cases, second and third and fourth generation of the very same concept is running the parks. All the parks, not just Walt Disney World, but Disneyland has retrofitted their shows, Paris, etc., Tokyo, etc., etc. So there's a lot of holes in that story, but that's pretty much the thread. And there's a lot of side streets in that thread, but that's pretty much it.
It's incredible that you and the team were able to pull that together under very tight constraints, because the park was going to open on that date. There was no way around it. So the fact that you were able to do that is crazy. So when you got the system up, you mentioned it was set up where it would program for, the animators. What's it like to then have to work with them to program an attraction? Because I'm sure they needed a lot of hand-holding and work to make that connect. How did that go?
Well, the first part of doing that was to win over a very small number of animators and convince them that they were not going to get canned because the computer was suddenly going to do this miraculous thing. Once they became true believers that all we were doing was making them a better tool to do their job faster and truly better, and basically give them more time off, they became pretty happy. Now, only a few of the old-timers that had come over from the studio, only a few of them ever touched the console. The guys that touched the console, the animator console most, were Bill Justice and Wathel Rogers. Mark Davis would sit next to, in many cases, me, example, doing the Bear Band show. He would sit next to me and tell me what he wanted the Bears to do. And I would try and get him and say, come on, Mark, just turn this knob and, throw this switch and then whatever. No, I don't want to do that. It'll explode if I touch it, whatever. We eventually had a technician guy whose name was Jack Taylor, who had gotten a job there because his father at one time was in charge of the sound department. And by the way, there was nepotism run rampant when I got there. I was one of the few people that didn't have a true in at the company. Almost everybody I ran into was a friend, neighbor, or relative of somebody else. In any case, Jack Taylor would also sit with guys like Mark Davis, and he would also kind of assist and run back and forth between the computer room and the programming area that we would set up with the animator's console out in the warehouse. We had this big warehouse, and the shows would be set up basically a scene at a time. You can imagine how that would work. And a scene would be animated, let's call it to 95%, and then another scene would be animated, and then upon shipment and installation in Florida, it would all come together, and we would often have an animator's console out in the show area. One of your notes said something about the jungle ride, doing it in the water, which was a no-brainer, except that it was a long cable run, and people got wet. There there was no technical challenge in that. It required doing that to synchronize things happening. If the elephant's going to squirt water when the boat goes through, you had to synchronize that, and synchronizing that or anything else required, a little timing. You'd set it up so that something would happen, and the boat would come along, and the guy was supposed to shoot a gun, and the elephant was supposed to come up, but maybe the elephant came up too soon, or it came up too late, so you had to change the cue, which was with the animation console, was a no-brainer. The animator would say, okay, and by the way, this is really important to understand. We designed that system around the vocabulary of the film business. Everything was done with foot and frames and timing. Basically, think of 24 frames per second, not 30, not like television. 24 frames per second, 16 frames per foot, blah, blah, blah. So that's how we communicated with the animators, and it made them feel good because we were speaking their language, which we sort of had to learn, but it was no big deal. That made them comfortable, and that's how it worked. They got very, very comfortable with the system. We still had crashes because we were running tape machines, which you probably know are no longer in use in that kind of business. We were running fixed head discs that only had 4K memory, and we had racks and racks of fixed head discs just to handle one show. Nowadays, your desk PC could handle pretty much every show in the park.
Yeah, I think that makes it more impressive that you were able to, you mentioned even having to have a wire to cross the water and such, which none of that, now they take their, portable whatever device into an attraction and work through it. I'd love to hear about, you mentioned this in interviews I read about lip syncing the attractions and how how that worked and kind of the program that was put together for shows like the Hall of Presidents and Country Bear Jamboree, how you ended up doing that and how that works.
Do you have a familiarity at all with how how it used to be done?
Not much, because obviously not from behind the scenes. I'm mostly seeing it from a guest perspective.
It's pretty easy to understand. If you think about a 2-track magnetic tape, audio tape, okay? A 2-track audio tape. One track is Pavarotti singing, and on the other track, you want to have a cue that turns on a spotlight or opens a curtain. You got that?
Yeah.
So in order to have a cue, and this is on the second track, the show programmers would have, let's just call it a buzzer for simplicity. They would say, when Pavarotti says, whatever, they push the button, the buzzer. And that track, that one buzz, and maybe there are 2 buzzes or 3 or whatever, meant turn on the light or raise the curtain or whatever. So that's how it had been done. Mouth action was done in a similar way, but obviously there were multiple tracks on the tape because there are multiple audio channels in every show practically. Instead of pushing a button for a buzzer like was done pretty much with the tiki room, which you can imagine pretty easy to have a bird's beak open up when he's going to say tiki, tiki, tiki room. You can push, push, right? Mouth action, a lot harder because the audio animatronic figures were not digital. The critical moves were analog moves. Analog meaning voltage controlled 0 to 10 volts. And I don't know what you know about computers, if anything, but 0 to 10 volts turns out to work pretty good with an 8-bit byte on a computer. One of the ways they did mouth action was Ken O'Brien, an old-time animator from the studio, and some of the guys in the back room devised, they took an old, I don't know what it was old football helmet probably, and they made a movable jaw on this football helmet, and they had what's called a transducer on this jaw, And so Ken O'Brien would put this helmet on, and he would basically lip sync. And as he opened his mouth, the transducer would cause 10 volts to go to the figure. As he closed his mouth halfway, there'd be 5 volts going. And you can imagine everything in between, right?
Yeah.
Easy. However, you can imagine even today's singers that are trying to lip sync, how hard it is to lip sync and be completely in sync for a long period of time. And the animated figures don't respond as fast in every case. In other words, you could have 3 different bears, and bear A might have I'm just going to throw out a number. It might have a 10 millisecond response. Bear B could have a 20 millisecond response, and bear C could have something in between, whatever. So if you said the word no with your helmet, or I'll say a better word, hello, where your jaw comes down and sends out signals, maybe one bear's mouth is open right away and the other one's a little bit behind, and maybe the other one's further behind, I don't know. But that's not very satisfactory. We had to deal with that in the animation control system. And the way we did it initially was we wrote code that allowed us to take the digitized analog track and move it forward or backward a frame at a time, just like you do on a thing called an Avid. Or because I don't know your technical background, it's a little hard for me to really explain this to you.
Sure. I would just as straightforward as you can.
Well, okay, so here's an analogy for you. You take a piece of 35 millimeter film, which I know you've seen, and instead of cutting it in half, cut it longitudinally. And just take a 1 foot piece and cut it longitudinally so that you've got sprockets on the top and sprockets on the bottom, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so now pretend that you have somebody singing on the top track, and you have these 0 to 10 volt signals on the bottom track. If you're lucky, the bottom track lines up with the top track and everything works nicely. But if you're not, and the bear opens his mouth too soon, with the thing we just described, you can slide it physically, in this case, slide it forward or slide it backward to accommodate the lag in the system, the hysteresis in the system. Pretty cool.
Wow. I'm still amazed that, hearing you describe it, what you're able to accomplish with those shows for the opening and after is it even more amazing to me how it was done.
Well, there's parts of the story that you don't know, and there's a whole other story which has to do with the resistance that we got from the studio to do what we were doing, including your note here has the black hole mentioned and some other things. We had such resistance, it was pathetic, mainly because the union people at the studio were worried that us computer guys are going to make things happen so fast that the union people would be seen smoking and sitting out eating lunch too much, and they'd all get fired. That was an uphill battle. That's a political battle that's a whole hour to explain.
I can imagine, because whenever there's new technology, you're hearing about it now today with things being automated and AI and everything. So back then it was probably a similar deal, but in a different sphere. So I can get it, though I'm sure that didn't make things easy for you.
Well, it made it incredibly difficult because you had not only call it a quality schedule and budget issue, but you also had a political issue. And so you're out trying to be your best salesman, and basically what you're doing in some cases is begging for money. I'll give you a specific example. The people that did data processing and punched holes in cards and did your payroll and inventory, those people got paid, I'm going to just rough it here, but they got paid $200 a week. People that were doing real-time process control, like I was doing, were making $350 and $400 a week. Now, when I went to the compensation board and said, oh, here's a guy I really want this guy because he knows this particular stuff that we really need. I need to pay him $500 a week. There were times when I was told, you cannot hire that guy because he's going to make more than you do, meaning me. And I said, guess what? There's a good reason he should make more than I do because he knows more than I do. He's older. He's more experienced. He's done this particular thing, and I haven't, and it's worth it. It's going to take me 6 months to get there. This guy can walk in the door, and in 1 week, he can solve my problem. It's worth it. So that's an argument, and a long one, and a screaming and shouting argument. These are not pleasant issues. So you lay the union issues on top of compensation issues. I get upset just talking about it. I'm going to tell you one little story. Everybody's heard this story but you, and here it is. Do you recognize the name Ed Catmull?
It sounds familiar, yes.
Well, Ed Catmull is the genius that brought computer-generated imagery to the Walt Disney Company and Pixar, etc. Look him up, Catmull. I tried to hire Ed Catmull and was told I couldn't because of his salary demands. And so what do you think happened? Disney lost him, and they lost the edge of doing computer animation for years until Catmull came back, and now probably makes $500,000 a year or something. Who knows? I don't know. Ed, with his experience at the time and his thoughts for his own personal career, was asking for, I don't know what, $100 a week more than I was being paid. And the compensation people, there's no way. We don't allow that to happen. The boss gets the highest paid and everybody else gets less. And I had to fight that. And I won a couple times. I hired a couple guys that got paid more than I, but the grief and aggravation I had to go through was silly and stupid. I could have been doing much more fruitful work instead of arguing about salaries. You know, good people are worth a lot of money. That's all I can tell you.
Yeah, and I think that's the case in any industry. So it's understandable, unfortunately.
There's a slogan. The slogan is simple. There's nothing more expensive than cheap help.
Right, yeah, because then you end up extra training, rehiring, the whole deal.
Yep.
So I also wanted to ask you about EPCOT Center. What kind of programming did you do for EPCOT and the Communicore pavilions?
Here's the deal about EPCOT that you should know. EPCOT didn't have a central computer. EPCOT wasn't run at all on the digital animation control system. And EPCOT was not hardly even a part of what Walt Disney Imagineering did. Every show in EPCOT was done by two people and the people they hired. One person was me. The other person was a guy by the name of Paul Nyland. Disney had a major construction company out of New York. It was called Tishman Construction, one of the biggest construction companies in the world. And it was Tishman's responsibility, really, to build Walt Disney World, meaning, let's call it all the brick and mortar stuff, if you will. So suddenly we have a system that can animate shows smoothly. Other people can run it. Other people can turn the knobs on the console. Other people can spool up the data and put the data where it needs to be and do all that stuff. But there's nobody to do anything in EPCOT. What the hell's EPCOT? And what is it? And what are we going to put in there? And nobody knew what to put in there. This whole thing about experimental prototype community of tomorrow was down the tubes. That wasn't going to happen, certainly not for opening day or ever, as it turns out. So what happened was, yours truly was given the ball, and they said, David, work with whoever you can and come up with some ideas for EPCOT that look kind of futuristic, whatever. And I thought, well, I don't know, it's not a futurist. And Paul Nyland from Tishman was in my back pocket every minute to make sure that I didn't spend too much money or contract for something that wasn't going to happen or whatever. A really good guy. We got to be super duper friends. I went back and forth to New York and all over the country with Paul. But everything you remember in EPCOT was a standalone, run by itself entity. There was some very clever stuff there. The Future Choice Theater was was invention from the get-go. All that polling stuff and either for projectors, putting real-time data from guests up on the screen, all from scratch, implemented by a hole-in-the-wall company out of Louisiana that nobody had any confidence in, including me, but I couldn't find anybody else that thought they could do it. And they came through and they, working with the functional specification, which I wrote on about 3 pages of notebook paper, probably by hand, as I recall. A Studer computer is a little different, but build a roller coaster. I don't know if you knew that one.
Oh, yeah. I played that as a kid.
Well, build a roller coaster was 100% my idea. That was run with a standalone video disc, an interactive video disc. You know, at that time, you should remember that video discs came out with video on them, programs. But a video disc could be programmed with very simple, if this, then that type programs. So that was done that way. No central computer, nothing like it, whatever. The travel port, same idea with some television stuff and with a beautiful aesthetic design by a car designer by the name of Kurt Brubaker. All standalone stuff. The flag game programmed in a friend of mine's garage on the equivalent of a Radio Shack TRS type computer that was, equivalent, so to speak. Not that bad, but, it fit inside the box. It didn't have to have any central control. But we invented stuff the public had never seen, had never had the opportunity that I know of to use an interactive touchscreen by touching a screen and having something happen. The flag game, as an example, you built a flag for whatever country by touching little parts of the flag. That touch device, which had been invented by a guy in Chicago, was put into first public use, as far as I know, in EPCOT Center. Now, one thing I should mention is that there were things, not only in EPCOT Center, but in other parts of the park, that were being monitored for correct operation by the central computer when it was not busy programming a show. It was looking for correct operation of stuff. And if the stuff didn't operate correctly, I'll just say a bell would ring, if you will. Excuse me, but a bell would ring. And there were two girls sitting at the console, and they would dispatch by radio a person to that area to find out what happened and fix it. We had a 16-station interactive thing that we did for Exxon that was meant to find out while people thought about the oil business, and we had to set it up so they didn't know why they were really answering the questions. The best thing in Epcot was a guy by the name of, he was a singer, Michael Iceberg, and he had a thing called the Great Iceberg Machine. Have you ever seen or heard it?
No, this is all new to me, which is saying a lot for Epcot. So go on.
Well, Epcot had a thing called Tomorrowland Terrace. Remember Tomorrowland Terrace? It wasn't really part of Epcot. It was out in the corner there of the park. But that was what it was called, Tomorrowland Terrace. Mm-hmm. And Michael Iceberg and the Iceberg Machine played there for, years. You need to look up Michael Iceberg and see what he did with synthesizers way ahead of his time. He was one of the greatest one-man entertainers that I had ever seen. I used to sneak off and watch his show every chance I could get. I would sit and watch his show and just shake my head saying, how can this guy do that all by himself? I have no idea. And he would do it, their sweat would be running down his face, and oh my God. And he was funny as hell. And in any case, that was something people hadn't seen either. Nobody had seen the Iceberg Machine or anything like it until they went to Tomorrowland Terrace and had lunch or whatever.
Yeah, well, I loved, I mean, all of that. It's interesting. So you mentioned a Studer computer, which became Backstage Magic a few years later, where you'd go in and you would see all those computers like from up above. So obviously they weren't controlling a lot. You mentioned that that it was kind of doing checking on operations and such, but was a lot of that for show for the guest? Because, to see all of that?
It had a twofold goal. There was a contract with Sperry to provide computers for data processing after the RCA 301 computers left and the RCA agreement with Walt became null. So it was for show, number one, and it did a little bit of stuff. But the monitoring that I mentioned was all done through the Honeywell 16 machine, the 516 machine in the Fantasyland basement. The Studer computer was strictly a gag to the Pease UNIVAC. That was the same for American Express with Travelport. It was the same for Exxon sponsoring their stuff. Basically, everything in the park was, paid for
Sure.
by United States industry.
Yeah. That was still kind of the World's Fair model and early Disney model with a lot. I mean, they still have sponsors now, but especially the way that they did that.
Yeah, well, it worked out pretty well.
Oh, yeah, it's great. It was great. I love that park, especially as a kid. Future World blew my mind because I was the right age for it, like in the 80s. It was something.
Well, you probably were gee-whizzed by the leapfrog fountains and the water jumping over the...
All of it, that, Communicore, all the pavilions. I was, right in the, I was like, I think I went in 84 and I was 8 years old. So I was into space and everything. It was the perfect age for it. So we spent a lot of time at Communicore.
That's the way it was supposed to be. I don't know, Communicore didn't have that much that I remember at opening. I know a lot of stuff got put in later, but, I left the company at the end of 88. Things were still growing and changing, and as they should and as they needed to be.
Well, yeah, for sure. But I do remember in the 80s, before it kind of shifted, that it was still a lot of the things you just talked about, the Travelport and the coaster and everything was really impressive. Well, I want to make sure, you mentioned it earlier. I want to make sure we get to talk a bit about basically something revolutionary that you helped create for the Black Hole, the camera system, the ACES system, and how that works. So I'd love to hear a bit about how that came to being and what that was.
Well, about year 2 of my tenure at Disney, I had spent a lot of time going back and forth to the studio, and I got to know people, and I got to see how things were done. And every time I saw how something was done, I realized that it was the old hand crank approach to whatever. People were using Frieden Flexowriter calculators to do math, which you probably never would ever want to see one of those. So my mind used to wander and think about, God, just put a computer here and run that thing, have a computer do this. I wanted to have a computer draw pictures. I drew pictures of the computer on a CalComp plotter, and I showed it to people at the studio, and they said, "Oh, that's cute." I said, this idea is something that I don't know, 5 or 10 years, computers can do animation. This is how you do it. It's just X and Y and dots on a thing, and the computer can do that and do it really fast. It can do it in color. So, yeah, well, okay, thank you, David. Let's have another lunch someday. I proposed, I had a document, it was probably 50 pages, and it was called The Automated Stage. And what I had proposed was all kinds of ways to automate a stage, automate the lighting, the placement of the lighting, the lighting cues, the movement of cameras, everything you can think of on a stage or having to do with pre-production and then also having to do with post-production. And I sent that to the president and vice president, and I made a presentation with all the appropriate storyboards. And I said, "This sounds like fun. Thank you very much. We'll Don't call us, we'll call you. You know? I probably did that 3 times, and I finally thought I got other stuff. I think about that time, I was thinking about having a family, but my son was born in 72, and I had other things to do. Then one day I got a call from the president of the company. I think his president, his name was Don Tatum. And he said, is this Snyder? I said, yeah, it's David Snyder. He said, get over here. Where's here? He said, this is Don Tatum. I'm the president. Get over here in my office. I said, well, when? He said, well, now. Okay, fine. I got in my car and drove over and went into Don Tatum's office, a really nice office, lots of expensive furniture. And there were 4 or 5 people sitting around, and one of the people was a guy by the name of Art Cruikshank. Art Cruikshank was in charge of special effects for the studio. He was the special effects wizard. And Cruikshank was known as a practical effects guy. In the special effects world today, there are 2 types of effects. One's called a practical effect, like an explosion where there's really an explosion, or a car crash where there is really a car crash. And then the other world is, the digital domain, where there's just, computer model crashed the car. So that's Art Cruikshank was a practical effects guy. At the time, Ron Miller, who had married Walt's daughter, so naturally he was the vice president. And I used to see him up there was a men-only lunch club. That's a whole other story. But anyway, Ron Miller was there and a couple other guys. And they said, oh, okay, we're making this movie called The Black Hole. And I said, oh, how jolly for you. That sounds really cool. They said, we need some help with one of the key shots in the movie. It's a pivotal shot. The movie cannot be made without this shot and subsequent shots. I said, well, fine. There's Art's right. Here's Art. He knows how to do shots. They said, well, it's a little more difficult, perhaps. I said, well, okay, Art, tell me what you're doing. And he said, well, we got this model that's like 20 feet long, and it has all these little pixie lights, thousands of little lights on it, and it has to move, and we have to photograph it in high precision, and I don't think we can do that. And I said, no, you can't. You're right. You can't do that. I said, but you can do it with a computer. Art said something like this. He said, you know what? I have a slogan I'm going to give you, which is, to a man with a hammer, all problems are nails. That's what Art Cruikshank said to me. I said, well, Art, I'll tell you what. Why don't you just do it by yourself? I'm really busy over at WDI, and I think you could do it with a computer, but maybe somebody else could help you. And so if you guys will excuse me, I'd like to get the hell back to work. Wait. What? How can you do this? Once again, can we do it tomorrow? One of those deals, They finally decided it had to be done a new way, and of course it had to be done tomorrow, meaning zero schedule. And I said, well, okay, here's what you have to do. And I gave them just a quick overview. And they said, well, can you do that? I said, yeah, I can do it. Can you do it by tomorrow? Which was, 2 months or 3 months or something. I said, yeah. And then they said, how much will it cost? And I said, I can do it for under $100 million. I'm sorry. I got fired because I was such a smart ass, really. And they said, don't be a jerk. I said, well, it's true. I can do it for under $100 million. They said, no, we need a budget. I said, well, here's a flash for you, gentlemen. You're asking me to do something that's never been done before. You need to have it on this kind of a schedule. I don't even know who I can get to help me. And I can't work to a budget. What it costs is what it costs. I've got to have the power to write purchase orders and not go through the mill that you make me go through every time. If you want this done, I can do it, but you get out of my way and don't talk to me until I'm done. It went like that. I mean, the words are different, I'm sure.
Yeah, sure.
And I'm not very well liked at that point. So we got busy, and we did this prototype. And guess what? There was a studio manager. His name was Bob Jabot. Bob Jabot and Art Cruikshank got together, and they somehow or another went to the union. I think it was the Grips or somebody union. And the union came back and said, no, we cannot do this with a computer. This is a union job. This is a job for union photographers and for union grid, for union this and for union that. And I said, well, okay, I'll tell you what, let's do. I'm going to set up a little demo here, and I'm going to move this camera 1/100th of an inch, and I'm going to bring it all the way back, and I'm going to move it once again, I'll move it 1/100th of an inch, and I'm going to move it 2 feet. And at the end of the 2 feet, we put a mark on the floor, and then I'm going to make it go backwards, put a mark on the floor, then push the button again. It's going to go 1/100th of an inch at a time, and it's going to take, 15 minutes to get to the other point, and it's going to be exactly there when it stops. So here's what you do. Get your grips and get their camera dolly, and put a mark on the floor and have them move it 1/100th of an inch at a time and hit that mark and do it about 10 times in a row. We can't do that. Are you kidding? I said, well, that's the point, gentlemen. That's exactly the point. So get the union out of my hair so I can finish my work. So we built the automated camera effect system, ACES, run by Data General Computer. And by the way, we got patents. It was the second motion control camera in Hollywood. And it had control of every axis on the camera stand and everything on the camera, including the shutter. You know anything about photography?
Not that much. A little bit.
Do you know what an f-stop is?
Yeah.
Well, on your camera you have f8, f16. That's pretty small f-stop, right?
Yeah. That
lets in very little light. The f-stop on the ACES camera was f64 to f128. Some of our exposures took 20 minutes for each exposure. Why so long and why such a tight f-stop? Because the model was 20 feet long and we had to hold the depth of field. It was the only human way to do it.
It's incredible that even a computer could do that with some amazing work from you and others.
No, it was easy for the computer to do it. The computer had no problem doing that at all. I mean, it was the programmer's job to program it.
Yeah.
And it was the machine shop's job to build I'll call it the mechanisms that we were going to push and pull. They had to build stuff, and then we had to go out and buy a bunch of stuff.
Well, I will say, I haven't seen that film in a while, but I've seen it before. I mean, the movie itself is what it is, but the visual effects and like shots like that going by are incredible. I mean, they really hold up.
Well, you have to, I say 20 feet, it might have been 15 feet, but in any case, that shot, if you were to ask anybody in the film business today how that was done, if they didn't know how it was done, they would say, oh, that's a CGI. It's a computer thing. Big deal. Who cares? Who cares? That's, make it fly, make it go up to the top of the whatever. And they would be right. But we're talking about 75 or so, I don't know.
Yeah, late 70s, I think it was filmed.
So now you know all the secrets.
That's impressive. I just, I love that story. And plus too, the fact that you had to deal with so many other things beyond just the work to get it done. The fact that it happened is great.
Well, it was technology being pushed to its limits and politics being fought to the limits at the same time. And by the way, that's a patented device. My name's on the patent.
Yeah.
I have a write-up on that somewhere. It's just a couple pages I did so people could understand easily, pictorially. If I can find it, I will send it to you.
I'd love to see it. It would be amazing.
It's a pretty slick document and easy to understand when you see it in front of you.
Yeah. Well, I feel like we've been talking for a while. We've covered maybe 2% of your career, but it's been amazing to talk with you, David. All I can say is thanks so much for coming on and telling your story, and hopefully we can dig even further sometime in the future.
Your choice. As long as I'm still walking around on this earth, my memory's pretty good. Not perfect. Some of the stuff I've said is probably anywhere from 75 to 100% accurate. Actually, probably better than that. I'd give myself 90 to 95% accurate plus, because I lived it. It was so intense. I've done a lot of other things in my life, but for whatever reason, I don't have the same intensity of memory for some of the other things I've done. Except when it came to women, then I remember a few things.
Well, we'll leave that for another day.
I think we should. My wife could be listening.
Well, thanks so much. This was awesome. I'd like to give a big thanks to David for being on the show, and to Rick Harper for helping to set up this conversation. If you enjoyed this podcast, you should definitely check out my shows with Rick, plus others with Peggy Ferris and Bob Baranek. You can find those shows at tomorrowsociety.com. You can also follow me on Twitter at TomorrowSOC, or Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society. You can send me an email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com. And of course, you could become a member of the Tomorrow Society through Patreon at patreon.com/Tomorrow Society. The Tomorrow Society podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Next time, I am talking with Joe Lancicero, who started at Disney as an animator in the 1980s and then went on to some big roles at WDI, including being the lead designer of Mickey's Toontown, several lands at Tokyo Disney Sea, Disney Cruise Line, and Mystic Manor at Hong Kong Disneyland. You do not want to miss this show. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, and I will talk to you again very soon.